Hello InfoPerson, this is Anton, and for decades, astronomers looked to the stars in order to discover some kind of an intelligent life out there. I'm of course referring to the project known as SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. But it turns out that a slightly different project, referred to as Project CETI, with the letter C, not S, has actually been focusing on something deep inside our oceans. And well, they've actually found it. Turns out some of the most complex communication systems known to us might have been right here in the oceans all along, which is essentially what we're going to be discussing today. And if you're not going to watch the whole video and just want to learn something super quick, here's a quick factoid. Apparently, whale language seems to have a very similar structure to Chinese. But anyway, let's discuss this in a little bit more detail and talk about a lot of different studies from the last few months, because we've actually had a lot of research focusing on slightly different things, but basically coming to a somewhat similar conclusion. Whale communication is way more complex than we thought, and involves complexity we've never seen in any other animals except for, well, us. Their communication seems to be just as complex as our own, with the biggest breakthrough being the discovery of the whale phonology. They essentially use vowels. But we'll discuss this in a few minutes. Let's actually start with this. Or let's actually start with the assumption we used to have. We used to think of whale sounds as just simple calls or as a kind of a whale Morse code. In other words, researchers believe that their clicks are just like Morse code and possibly have some meaning, but not a lot of meaning. Yet turns out that this was far from true, and their vocalization involves a lot of complexity that's extremely similar to human speech, but more importantly, similar to some of the most complex languages on the planet. So basically here they have a kind of a sperm whale phonetic alphabet. And well, to understand why a lot of these discoveries are so shocking, we obviously have to first understand how these animals communicate, because not all whales talk the same way. And the whales we're focusing on here are sperm whales, which actually don't use songs like the humpback whales, and instead communicate using short bursts and usually a variety of rhythmic clicks that scientifically are referred to as codas. Here's what they actually look like on a sonograph, but here's what they look like if you were to analyze them and create a kind of a comparison chart. And since the 1980s, scientists have used underwater microphones, referred to as hydrophones, to continuously record these sounds and then analyze them using spectrographs. So essentially here we have a lot of data from decades and decades of research. And importantly, a lot of these create visual maps, making things just a little bit easier to analyze. And one of the first discoveries from decades ago was that sperm whales seem to live in a kind of a matrilineal society, or basically societies oriented around a mother, and they seem to always live together, hunting, babysitting, and even forming a kind of a clan. And it's actually the discovery of these clans that was a little bit surprising, because here each clan seems to have their own accent, or a specific identity coda, and a specific vocal style. And so a lot of this modern research show that many of these clans use very specific identity codas to mark their own culture. So you can kind of think of these as a national anthem or something. And interestingly, with different clans living near each other, they actually learn to mimic each other's vocal styles through social learning. But they do so while keeping their own unique vocal styles completely separate. Which essentially tells us that whale communication is not an instinct. This is not something they're born with. It is definitely cultural and something they learn from members around them. Now, previously, something like this has only been observed in primates, certain complex birds, and of course humans. But over the last 3 decades, a lot of these discoveries were kind of incremental, and the real revolution began between 2024 and 2026. This was the official discovery of the phonetic alphabet. And so here researchers from the Project SETI, with a C, or Cetacean Translation Initiative, whose website you can find in the description, used a specific machine learning algorithm to go through years and years of data and to basically analyze and match a lot of these clicking patterns, in the process discovering that the sperm whale communication seems to be combinatorial. This was one of the first discoveries in 2024. And in simpler terms, they have a set of basic building blocks very similar to our letters and phonemes that they can then remix and combine in order to create an almost infinite variety of messages. And so using some of these mathematical models, and actually models very similar to what we usually use in chatbots like ChatGPT, scientists identified 156 distinct codas, or distinct phonetic sounds, I guess letters, that whales used in their communication, but in some cases they actually changed them just a little bit by adding extra clicks or by stretching and shortening the timing of a sequence, which basically suggests that a single word in this case may have many different meanings depending on how it's delivered. Or maybe they were just conjugating sentences, just like we do in certain languages. But that was 2 years ago, because in the last couple of years it got even more unusual. In late 2025 and early 2026, SETI researchers published a new finding showing that the whales actually use something extremely similar to human vowels. And so here, by looking at the resonant frequencies of clicks, what researchers usually call formants, they identified two distinct patterns they named A codas and I codas. And these are not just random sounds. The A codas seem to be generally longer than I codas, with the whales even using a kind of a long I versus short I, which is extremely similar to many human languages. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was what's known as coarticulation. This is a phenomenon where the sound of one vowel is slightly shaped by the vowel that came before it, which requires an incredibly high level of physical control over their own vocal apparatus. As a matter of fact, no animal except for humans is able to do this. And though for humans we obviously have this inside our throats, for whales they seem to have this system, and actually it's a massive system, involving air sacs, or these phonic lips, inside their heads. So here's roughly how this looks like. And well, the reason I mentioned that their language seems to be very similar to Chinese arises from the way sperm whales use their vocal building blocks in order to produce a kind of a tonal and spectral pattern. And so just like in Mandarin Chinese, where the same syllable can have entirely different meanings, mostly depending on the tone or the pitch and contour, here the study discovered that the sperm whales use rising, falling, and rising falling tones in the resonance of their clicks. And so the example scientists provide is ma. Now, I'm not going to try to do the Chinese ma because I don't really have the skills to produce those tones, but in Chinese, the same syllable has at least 4 separate meanings. It can mean mother, hemp, horse, or scold. And while something extremely similar seems to happen in the whale language. They seem to modulate the spectral properties, creating what they call a diphthongal pattern, or a kind of a gliding vowel that exists in certain human languages. And so it's really this part that personally blew my mind, because we knew whale communication was complicated, but we had no idea it was Chinese complicated. And that's coming from me, who tried to learn Chinese and Korean many times but failed miserably. So yeah, these are really complex languages. Although I guess the question in this case is, why do they need such a complex language? Well, we got a glimpse of an answer in March of 2026. And you can sort of see what's happening here. Now, this blood, that's not actually anyone getting hurt. This is whale birth. Here, scientists were able to capture an extremely rare footage of a collaborative sperm whale birth. And they basically observed a midwife-like behavior where completely unrelated females, and not just family members, seem to work together to lift a newborn to the surface in order to help it to take its first breath. And importantly, this wasn't just recorded from the skies, this was also recorded using underwater microphones. And for researchers, this was an incredibly important recording. Here, during this crisis, it showed distinct shifts in vocalization and the use of very specific vowel-like structures, suggesting they were using their language in order to coordinate this life-saving support. And this kind of a level of cooperation between non-relatives and completely unrelated animals is almost unheard of in the animal kingdom. It essentially points at a society built on deep communication, just like our own. This was actually from March of 2026, and as of today, this is one of the most incredible discoveries from Project SETI. But this is just sperm whales for now. Although we do have some studies on the humpback whales and of course dolphins. And so at least one study from 2025 on the humpbacks was also able to discover a kind of a statistical structure that they also contain, and it's also similar to known human languages. Naturally though, their communication style is very different from the sperm whales. And here scientists use methods usually used to study how human babies learn to speak, discovering that the humpback songs follow predictable mathematical patterns, with certain parts being repeated. But once again, here it's not clicks, its songs. Although the conclusion from this study is that we still have to be very careful about how we interpret these results. Here, this could be just music, even though it does seem to be kind of complex and resembles communication. Or just to rephrase this, these are interesting mathematical discoveries, but unlike the sperm whale studies, at the moment we don't really know how complex communication from these whales is. And so when it comes to humpback whales, we just don't know as much. But because Project SETI relies on a new technique referred to as WAM, or Whale Acoustics Model, in the future it's probably going to be applied to other species in order to discover what's happening here. As a matter of fact, right now this model can sometimes even predict what a whale might say next, kind of like one of those text predictors on our phones. And last but not least, we also have at least one study on dolphins, although technically this one I guess is sponsored by Google. And so here Google AI helped create what's known as Dolphin Gemma. We've actually talked about this in one of the previous videos in the description, so you can learn more details in that video. But in a nutshell, this is a kind of a language model designed to find patterns in dolphin speech that's usually just a little bit too subtle for human ears to catch. And though we don't really have any updates about this just yet, the research on this is still going on, and we'll probably have some really cool results in the next few years. But overall, I guess one question is, so how does this matter for us, for our understanding? I mean, because this is not just about talking animals, this is about communication in general. And right now, understanding whale communication challenges the idea that humans are the only ones with a true language. Because in this case, we're extremely close to decoding what they're actually saying, understanding their priorities, their history, and even how they see the world. Which of course has a massive implication on a lot of fields of biology, fields of neuroscience, and even linguistics. Although obviously exactly what these implications are and what we're going to learn about all of this, only time will tell. At the moment, the only facts we have is that sperm whales seem to have an incredibly complex speech pattern resembling human language. And for the first time in history, we actually have the technology to listen and to analyze these patterns. But understanding this will probably take some time. So basically, we don't really know exactly what they're saying just yet. I just hope it's not 6767, because my kids have been driving me crazy with this. And so anyway, despite all of the issues and problems in the world right now, it makes me just a little bit more hopeful to know that we're moving from a world where whales were just a resource and were basically harvested for something, to a world where we see them as these mysterious giants that seem to have their own identity, their own families, their own clans, and complex stories. Something that one day, hopefully not too far away, we'll be able to understand. And if they have a language, it means that they also very likely have a perspective, or basically an opinion about this world. And understanding their perspective would be super important. On that note, we'll definitely come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos, because this is definitely some fascinating research. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else. Support the channel on Patreon, where you can find additional videos without any ads, and can DM me directly by joining the channel membership that grants you early access and a few additional videos, or by buying the wonderful person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye. And for sperm whales watching this,